time we had some sound problems, or more specifically, I. Our theme for this year is fire safety in construction. What's next? I'm Simon Hamlet. I'm the Senior Standards Manager for Built Environment and Fire at BSI, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us this morning. As events such as the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower have shown, it's essential that a holistic approach is taken to fire, construction and building safety. And today, we're bringing together stakeholders from across the built environment sector to share knowledge both about standards and about developments more widely. We've got a great programme lined up for you today from a wide variety of highly regarded expert speakers. There will be 3 sections separated by breaks for coffee and for lunch. In the first section, Martin Weller, the Associate Director for Fire Engineering at SNC Lavalin Atkins Reales, will be speaking about BS 9991, which is the standard for fire safety in the design, management and use of residential buildings. He will be followed by Rachel Smalley, the Head of Inclusive Design at Jacobs Solutions, and she will be talking to us about BS 9792, Fire Risk Assessment for Housing. And then to finish off the first section, Andrew Moore, the Head of Operations for Planning and Building Control for Higher Risk Buildings, Gateways 1 to 3, at the Health and Safety Executive, will be speaking about Gateways 2 and 3 and the building safety regime. That, as is traditional with online conferences, a little bit of housekeeping to do before we start. Maybe we have the next slide, please. Thank you. This is a listen-only webinar that is being recorded, and we would very much welcome your questions via the Q&A function. We'll hold a short Q&A section at the conclusion of the presentations, and you just need to click the Q&A button in the side panel and post your question. If you experience any technical difficulties, please submit your issue via that same Q&A function. Upon completion of the feedback survey, BSI will send you a link to a recording of the webinar in due course. This webinar is recognised for CPD, so please request your certificate via the feedback survey following the webinar. That brings me to the end of my introduction, and I'd therefore like to introduce Martin Weller. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, thanks for that introduction. My name is Martin Weller. I'm a Technical Director at Atkins Reales, and I sit on the drafting panel for BS 9991, which is due to be published next year, sometime next year. And I'm going to run through the main changes that there are in between the standard that's due for publication next year and the 2015 version. There's been an awful lot obviously happened since 2015, and the standards being updated to reflect the state of the art when it comes to fire safety in residential premises, and also to interlink with a number of other standards where work is going on at the moment. Before I start, I will say that the standards is a work in progress. We're running through the comments that we've received on the previous version and on the draft for public comment. And it's in the nature of those discussions that things change. So what I'm going to describe today is where we are at the moment. Don't take any of this as verbatim. Things might change in between now and publication. But with that as a little bit of caveat, let me go through the slides. Do I have control?
You do, Martin. I'm just going to, you should just be able to click on the screen.
Can you run through it for me? Doesn't appear to
I've just
work.
re-clicked it. You should just be able to try again, Martin.
There we go. So as I say, these are the main changes. They're not finalised yet. We're going to expand the scope of the standard to cover residential care. It's become apparent that that particular sector aligns far more comfortably with the residential standard than with other standards such as BS 9999. And just to explain a bit about where 9991 sits, it sits alongside the statutory guidance for the relevant devolved nations in the UK. And it's intended to be used across UK, and it's a different way essentially of complying with building regulations requirements in all the devolved nations. So it is necessarily different from the from that other guidance. We've revised the height limits for the installation of sprinklers. We're taking that down to 11 metres, and there's a significant expansion in the recommendations that we're going to include for sprinkler systems. There's quite a lot of new text in there as regards sprinklers. And other forms of water-based fire suppression systems are out of scope of BS 9991. So of course it doesn't mean you can't use them. Just means if you are going to use those, then they're not within the scope of this standard. And we've made quite significant changes to the variations that are permitted by sprinkler systems. And the sprinkler system variations are now covered in a table. So that includes things like open plan kitchens, extending travel distances and communal corridors, and reduction in periods of fire resistance. We've taken out the old national classifications for combustibility. The old BS 476 tests are gone. So we now refer only to the Euro classes to A1 and A2. And we are currently considering whether to retain the transposition table for other aspects of reaction to fire performance. At the moment in the draft, we have retained that table, but we're still discussing whether it's sensible to retain it or not. One of the big things that we're doing is updating the recommendations relating to lifts, including evacuation lifts. And you'll be hearing a little bit more detail about evacuation lifts in the forthcoming standards from Nick a bit later. But suffice to say that when you're talking about unassisted evacuation from high-rise residential premises, evacuation lifts are really the only practicable answer to new build. Of course, that's not quite so simple in existing premises, but when it comes to new build, they really are the main solution, in our opinion. So we've done an awful lot of work on evacuation lifts, and you saw that in the draft for public comment. There's still quite a bit to do, particularly as the standards at the moment, the lift standards, don't cater for the use of evacuation lifts in buildings with fire detection and fire alarm systems unassisted. The lifts will automatically be taken out of use if they're compliant with the relevant European standards, if you have a fire detection and fire alarm system. But we're hoping that the forthcoming EN 8176 will allow us to make the lifts do more clever things in these premises. And there's quite detailed recommendations as to how many evacuation lifts you need, where they need to be, and the protection to the evacuation lifts so that they can be used safely in a fire is tremendously important. And all that rich detail is going to be in the standard. We're updating the recommendations with regard to smoke control in the standard. There's quite a lot of detailed changes that are happening with regard to that, and it picks up some of the changes in the ENs and so forth that have happened since 2015. And we're going to change Annex A, which has quite a lot of the detail of for smoke control systems, from an informative to a normative annex. So for those that don't know, what that means is if you want to claim compliance with the standards, you now have to comply with the recommendations in that annex, because it's now normative. You wouldn't have had to do that if the annex was informative. We've done an awful lot of work on power supplies. and updating the recommendations relating to power supplies. There's a lot of new text in there on that, and again that picks up the state of the art with these systems, recognizing in particular the greater use of UPS for power supplies, and the text that's come into BS 8519 in the most recent version that covers that gives you technical recommendations if you want to use UPS as a secondary power supply for fire and life safety reasons in residential premises. And it's really important that those two, that 9991 and BS 8519 work in synergy, because that's a tremendously important issue, and getting that right really has a big economic effect on the viability of some premises and some projects. Updates to external walling systems, as you'd expect, to recognise the legislative changes that have happened throughout the UK on those sorts of systems. Updated recommendations on kitchens. We're dealing with balconies, and then of course there's the thorny issue of single stair buildings, and how high a building needs to be before you go from one staircase to two staircases. I mean, there's no doubt that we will retain the ability to build buildings of moderate height using single staircases, but of course the where you switch from single stair to more than one stair is a very topical issue at the moment, and we haven't quite nailed that one yet, in all honesty. We'll probably, I would think we'll probably align with the 18 metres that Michael Gove has announced will go in the approved document B, the English approved document B, but that's not absolutely decided at the moment. We haven't quite reached consensus on it, and we could come up with different recommendations. I mean, there's no point in having a British standard if all you're going to do is parrot the same recommendations that are already in other guidance. So the message with that is likely to be 18 metres, but it might be different. There still is a chance that it might be different. And the last thing is escape from basements. So again, we've had a lot of feedback from industry about particularly staircases that link basements and things like basement car parks and stuff like that. So we're updating the recommendations on that. And as I say, there's a general update that really takes into account all the standards changes that have taken place since 2015. There's been an awful lot of work, obviously, that BSI has been doing since then, and there's been some changes in the European standards arena as well. And but of course, so we'll finish with the key messages, just a wash-up summary. Lots of issues identified with the current standards. The drafting panel is currently rattling through the nearly 2,000 comments that were received both on the 2015 version and on the draft issued that were for public comment. And as you can imagine, that's a bit of a stupendous task. Each one of those comments has to be reviewed and it has to be resolved in order for the standard to be published. So if you've submitted a comment on the standards, rest assured that we will have looked at it and resolved it by the time the standard's published. And the new standard, it's responding to the constantly changing landscape of fire safety in residential premises in the UK. As most of you will probably know, there's a lot of new legislation that has landed. There's a lot of new guidance. There's a lot of new approaches. And it really was very timely to update this very important standard to reflect that changing landscape. And so the 2024 version of the standard will, as I say, seek to address those issues. And when it's published, it should represent the state of the art in the design, management and use of residential premises, or fire safety in residential premises in the UK. And we hope lots of people will use it. And that's the end of my presentation, a couple of minutes early. And I'd like to hand on to Rachel Smalley to talk about the forthcoming changes to standards for fire risk assessment in residential premises.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Martin. My name's Rachel Smalley, and as you heard from Simon's introduction and from the slide, I'm the Head of Inclusive Design at Jacobs. So why am I talking to you about BS 9792? I'm talking to you about BS 9792 today because we've taken a slightly different approach in the work we've undertaken on this standard. BSI have pulled together a panel of experts from a range of different disciplines, so it's not necessarily been the usual suspects working on this one. Away from the day job, I chair B559, which is the committee responsible for standards relating to inclusive design, accessibility in the built environment. So my role on the panel for 9792 has been as an inclusive design expert, providing input in terms of ensuring the standard set work for a diverse range of end users and end user requirements as well. So today I'm going to be focusing on those particular elements. So I'm going to start with what is BS 9792. 9792 is the successor to PAS 7092, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, and many of you probably know it far more intimately than I do. PAS 7092 was published, as you can see from the snapshot on the screen, in 2020. So what's changed since 2020? The review has been informed by feedback received since it was published, changes in legislation, which I'm sure you're all aware of, updated thinking around language and terminology, and I'm going to be talking more about that today in a bit more depth. Other standards published or that are currently in development, some of which you will be hearing about today, and also discussions held during the phase 2 of the inquiry as well. So one area we've considered at length in the new version is language and terminology. And that's an area that I'm going to be telling you about in more detail over the next 10 minutes. The new standard has worked very hard to adopt a more inclusive terminology. So yes, I'm afraid I am going to be saying to you that terminology does matter. I do inclusive design, so of course I'm going to say that, but in terms of terminology, I've picked out one particular term which is on screen at the moment, which is vulnerable persons. I've just picked this as an example. Did a quick exercise with people in the office. I asked them to kind of list off what groups of people they think could be covered by vulnerable persons in the fire safety context. And they came up with quite a list. They actually came up with a longer list of this, but I needed to fit it all on a slide, so this isn't a comprehensive list. But I just wanted to put this up to kind of highlight the range of people who could be or who are captured under the term vulnerable persons. There's also some similar terms like PRMs. I know everyone loves a good acronym, but PRMs, or persons of reduced mobility, again appears a lot in fire safety and rail industry as well. And I think people often use acronyms in place of more full description because they don't want to offend people or they're concerned about using wrong terminology. I do inclusive design, so I'd say it's important not to offend people, obviously, but I'd also question whether these big high-level catch-all terms like vulnerable persons or PRMs are actually accurate or helpful. do we know who we're talking about by using these big catch-all terms? The catch-all terms can kind of cover a full myriad of personal characteristics, but are they actually helpful? Do they say or describe the information someone needs to know undertaking a particular task? I'd ask if they're accurate as well, and do they provide a sufficient level of data or granularity? So basic test, the last line at the bottom of this slide. Do we know from the term vulnerable persons or PRMs if, for example, I'm picking an obvious example, I know if level access is required? So I'd say the term vulnerable persons, using it as an example, is not only inaccurate and sometimes unhelpful, but also many people find that term quite offensive as well. So we're moving away from that type of terminology. So going into the who and how to describe the who piece. Who are we talking about? The approach to the who from an inclusive design perspective is inclusive design works to incorporate the requirements of any protected characteristic group for whom the design of the built environment could potentially impact. So protected characteristic groups are taken from the Equality Act, and that definition is, to be honest, an inclusive design scope definition. However, kind of refining that further to the fire safety context, I've picked out 3 examples of protected characteristic groups. Yes, they are more obvious examples, but I've picked out these examples of groups of people who will potentially react in a different way in an emergency situation, but also have quite different requirements as well. So first up, we have age, which is a protected characteristic group, and under age, we look at a range of age groups, including older people, younger people, and children. So even within age, those different groups probably have very different requirements and may react in a very different way. Next up, disability. Big long list of conditions under disability there, and that's not actually a comprehensive list. I should put the disclaimer on there of including but not limited to. But I'll be coming back to that one on the next couple of slides in terms of diversity and range of conditions that come under disability. And lastly, we have people who are pregnant or have very young children. So the protected characteristic is pregnancy and maternity. And again, that can influence or impact on someone's reactions or requirements in an emergency situation. So the next slide is focusing in on one of those protected characteristics, disability. And it's just to show the range of and the diversity of conditions that come under disability. It also shows the intersectionality that exists between certain conditions and age. So the stats you're looking at are taken from the Family Resources Survey, and you'll see they're broken down by age group. So we have children, working age adults, and state pension age adults, and certain conditions or impairments feature more heavily or greatly in certain age groups. Classic example there, mobility impairments, far more prevalent in state pension age adults in this country. But also the line at the top of the slide, super important one for me, only 4% of disabled people are wheelchair users. So that 4% would come under mobility stats on this slide. But generally, when we talk about disabled people, most people think, wheelchair users. That's totally forgivable because we're surrounded by symbols depicting a wheelchair user on disabled persons' toilet doors, on disabled persons' parking bays. But this is just to show there is a far greater range of conditions and impairments which would come under disability and therefore different requirements as well. I'm not going to spend long on this slide, but I'm just showing it to illustrate that also people's requirements can vary by building design and attribute to. So this graph we're looking at the moment is based on a study which looked into user demand for evacuation lifts and the percentage of participants who would use a lift charted against the number of floors they'd be overcoming. So this is use of lifts in an egress situation. Not too surprisingly, the proportion of participants who would use or require a lift goes up as the number of floors go up. It's really important to kind of recognise this when looking at person-centred fire risk assessments, because the groups of people who may require a person-centred fire risk assessment could increase as, for example, the building gets taller. So imagine the extreme on this, a 500-metre tall building, more people will have more requirements in terms of level egress. So terminology, and I've gone through some phrases which have issues which we're moving away from at the moment, but what do we use instead? So in terms of who, I'd say always try to accurately state who or what the specific requirement is. If you do still want a catch-all term, a couple from a standard feature in that middle box there, we have building occupants with specific characteristics, and we have people with specific requirements relating to fire safety. So they're catch-alls without using the term vulnerable people. And again, they're just a little bit more accurate as well. But I'd also definitely suggest you go for a more focused approach, probably even focusing in on specific requirements or conditions and what this means in an emergency situation. So some more focused or situational requirement specific terms we have there, people with specific evacuation requirements, or even just people who require level egress. So a couple of quick notes on person-centred fire risk assessments. Key takeaway is it's super important to accurately capture who you're talking about and what the specific requirement is you're wanting to discuss. But a couple of notes on the term person-centred. Person-centred means a more tailored, focused approach. It doesn't mean we put blame on the person. So that's a super important point. But we do capture specific information and therefore tailor bespoke relevant solutions to them. So we need to be focusing on the characteristics of the residents, what their requirements might be. I've just put some examples up there in terms of communication requirements, mobility requirements. Some people may require level access or use specific mobility aids, and also any actions required. So big table on the screen at the moment. I'm not going to go through it in detail at all. I've just selected a few fields from what is a very comprehensive table in the standard. And these fields and the guidance we provide in the standard is designed to provide helpful guidance to achieve that kind of tailored person-centered approach. This just shows the depth of guidance now provided within the standard, and again, it's to assist users and people undertaking person-centered fire risk assessments. So, principal changes in 9792. Some restructuring of the document has happened. We've introduced subdivisions into clause 15 and brought the types of fire risk assessment up to sit under principles and scope towards the beginning. We've removed all third-party copyrighted material from the standard. There is a shiny new pro forma, which is very exciting. The commentary's been streamlined a lot. As I've mentioned today, we are updating the guidance relating to people with specific evacuation requirements. There's a new informative annex, an amazing annex, can I say, some of which may resemble the last slide we've just had a look at. And there's also general updates in there relating to other standards, work and legislative changes since December 2020. So what's not changed in 9792? I think it's also important to point this out. There are still 4 types of fire risk assessments in there. There is still no expectation that the fire risk assessor will be carrying out the person-centred fire risk assessment themselves. There's guidance in there around existing PCFRAs as well. The general principles for fire risk assessments do remain the same, and the 9 steps to fire risk assessment haven't changed. So they're items which haven't changed. So what are the next steps for 9792? The DPC will be launched, published and consulted on in the new year. We have pushed that back a little bit, but that's to avoid the Christmas holiday period, as we want as many people as possible to participate in the consultation. So no Christmas Eve consultation launches around here. It's going to be a 60-day consultation period, so please do look out for the consultation, have a look at the draft and provide comments. We really do value that process. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand across to Andrew now, who's going to be talking about gateways 2 and 3. My personal favourite gateway is Planning Gateway 1. Bit disappointed Andrew's missing that one today, but across to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. Really great to have the opportunity to speak to everyone here today. As Rachel just introduced, my name is Andrew Moore, and I'm the Head of Operations for the Planning and Building Control function within the BSR. So as Rachel just said, my responsibility includes Planning Gateway 1, but also the Building Control Application stage, commonly referred to as Planning Gateway 2, and completion certificates, often referred to as Gateway 3. Sorry, not Planning Gateway 2, Gateway 2. Really pleased to be with you today, particularly now that the BSR has taken on building control responsibility for design and construction of high-rise buildings. And I'm going to use this presentation to give a bit of an overview of this aspect. I'm going to be talking very much about the HRB gateways today. Higher risk building or high rise building, both terms can be used interchangeably. But I would like to really reinforce the message that the work that BSR is doing is about the whole industry responsibility and goes beyond high rise buildings, even though my presentation today will be very much HRB focused. A little bit about me. My background, I've been within the health and safety executive for 22 years, almost all of that time in an frontline operational role, managing teams of inspectors, working in a number of industries, but predominantly construction. And I've been with the BSR now for coming up to 3 years. The majority of my time, last 2.5 years, looking at the competence agenda, and more recently moving into the HRB team, looking at the building control activity, which, as I say, went live on the 1st of October. So it's exciting times for us at the BSR, because what has been theory for a number of years is actually now practice and real, and I can share some of my thoughts and learnings around that in the next 15 minutes. Next slide, please. I don't want to spend too much time looking backwards, but I think it's important to contextualize the new regime in Gateway 2, Gateway 3, and draw a direct line of sight between what happened in Grenfell and the new regulatory regime. Because, I mean, just to be very, I suppose, frank in summary, that Grenfell demonstrated that people cut corners, it demonstrated poor competence, poor behaviours, and far too much focus on reducing costs at the expense of doing a proper job. And I think a really good example to contextualise some of this is the evidence provided to the public inquiry by a number of the organisations, the contractors, subcontractors, designers, etc., who worked on the Grenfell project. And the barrister for the public inquiry asked each one of the representatives the same very simple question. And that question was, how did you know whether or not the work you were doing complied with the building regulations? And none of the representatives could give a satisfactory answer. They all kind of squirmed a little bit and gave the same answer, which was essentially, it wasn't my responsibility, it was someone else's. So the subcontractors blamed the contractors blamed the main contractor blamed the designers blamed the manufacturers, etc., round and round it went, leading the barrister for public inquiry to call this a kind of a merry-go-round of buck passing, was the words he used to describe the evidence that he had heard. And actually the whole purpose of the new regime is to try and stop this happening, learn the lessons from Grenfell, and ensure that everyone has a responsibility now, a responsibility for the management, the compliance, the building regs, and importantly, having the competence to do this. Can I have the next slide, please? So I just wanted to highlight very quickly the strategic aims for the BSR. And the reason for doing this was just to highlight that only two of those, the two in the centre, are related to higher rise buildings. And I just wanted to again reinforce that actually overseeing and driving improvements across the built environment in terms of technical policy, in terms of standards, in terms of the work that our various statutory committees, the competence committee, building advisory committee are doing, and also the regulation of the building control profession are as equally important to the BSR as higher risk buildings that we'll talk about today. Next slide. That said, the focus today is HRBs and particularly the gateway. So this is a bit of an overview, a diagram which shows how the process works. So just very briefly, the BSR has taken on the building control application process for higher rise, higher risk residential buildings. So those with 2 or more residential units, over 7 stories or 80 metres, which also includes the in-scope high-rise care homes or high-rise hospitals. So for these buildings, clients and developers can no longer choose who their building control body will be. It must use the BSR, these in-scope buildings. And at Gateway 2, developers are unable to proceed into the construction phase until the BSR has approved their plans. So the Gateway name is essentially a hard stop between design and construction, Gateway 2, and between finish of construction and occupation in Gateway 3. So at the moment, we have developed a portal, a web-based portal on gov.uk, where applicants, developers, clients can submit their plans, submit the supporting documentation to provide a building control application to the BSR. We're expecting a range of reactions from industry. I think it's probably fair to say that we've had a trickle of applications at the moment for smaller scale projects, so we haven't had in some of the larger projects yet. But it's going to be a big change for the construction industry, and people and organisations react differently to change. There's an established change curve, isn't there? With sort of starts off with disbelief, moves to anger, and then you finally there's something else, and you finally get to acceptance. I think some, therefore, in the industry will embrace this and make this work. Others will throw their hands up in the air and say this is the greatest disaster to befall the construction industry. And we're expecting different reactions from different people, and we'll look to address and mitigate those as they come. Getting back to the process, from a timing point of view, we have 12 weeks to consider an application at Gateway 2 and 8 weeks to consider the evidence for a completion certificate at Gateway 3. We're conscious this will be new for everyone, particularly developers, and we're expecting that we'll need some backwards and forwards, some discussion in terms of what the information that's submitted to us, and therefore extensions may be necessary at the beginning until industry get to grips with the expectations. I think the message though is that if we get good quality submissions to us, we will be able to turn those around in a efficient and effective manner. If what we get is of poor quality, that will obviously take us a little bit longer. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give some emphasis, rather than going too much into the process, just some emphasis that the BSR is bringing to the new building control function. And in my role of head of operations for building control, I've got ultimate responsibility for the gateway process. And if you ask me what my three top priorities were, to kind of borrow from Tony Blair, rather than education, I would say design, design, design. Because again, linking back to Grenfell, the independent review, one of the clear findings that came out of this review was that design was not being controlled, it was not integrated, and holistic assessments across a number of packages were not being carried out. So there's going to be a real strong emphasis on Gateway 2 compliance before any construction work happens. We often use the phrase before any spades go in the ground. And we recognise this is going to be a cultural shift, particularly to those that are working in construction, design, which are used to iterating as it goes. Again, let's be honest, design and build methodology, where construction and design happen in parallel, is the most obvious example. However, the BSR is going to be very strong on this point. And what we really want to prevent is the examples that we see at the moment, following on from Grenfell, that where fire engineers, for example, are brought in right at the end of the construction process, and they need to put in suboptimal workarounds where better solutions could have been implemented if these had been thought about, discussed, baked into the design at the beginning. So we want all of these design considerations to be front loaded. And then when we move to that Gateway 3 stage, the completion certificate, the question we'll be asking isn't, can we just about argue this complies with the building regulations? Because all of those conversations we'll have had at the design stage at Gateway 2, our approach will be, has it been built to design? And again, we'll be quite strong on that. I'm conscious there is some concern within the industry from some quarters that front-loading design will increase costs, will increase time. However, I've spoken to a number of people who say actually that what actually will happen is it's likely to lead to more engagement, more collaborative working with clients. And this is hopefully going to lead to less delays, less extra work, less overruns, and less litigation. So the overall cost and the overall time is hoped to be quicker and cheaper. Next slide, please. One of the other new emphasis, which I think is important to call out and explain, is around the pre-application, the advice, the service provision that we as a BSR are not going to provide. And just to kind of contextualize this, at the moment, the majority of building control authorities within the private sector and the public sector work with clients, work with applicants before they submit building control applications. And this is called a pre-application service. The BSR won't be providing this service for a number of, I suppose, quite fundamental reasons. Firstly, as sort of set out within the anecdote I mentioned previously about the Grenfell inquiry, we want industries to step forward to take ownership of understanding the building regulations. And therefore, if we don't step back as a regulator, there's no incentive for the construction industry to make these changes, to make the cultural changes that we're looking for. And I suppose, as importantly, or possibly more importantly, we don't want to be providing a design service to a client under the pre-application service, using a kind of commercial hat almost, and then take off that commercial hat and put on a regulatory hat to essentially mark our own homework. Dame Judith Hackett, in her independent review following Grenfell, was very critical of regulators simultaneously providing a service and also being a regulator. So we think it's really important to put clear blue water between any commercial activities and our role as a regulator. So we won't be providing pre-application advice, which again is a big change for the industry. Next slide, please. I just wanted to talk about some of the additional information, some of the new requirements for submissions with a building control application. And I wanted to reflect firstly on management arrangements. And although the construction control plan, which the title of this document is an HRB specific requirement, actually the new requirements for management arrangements are not HRB specific. They apply to all buildings. The requirement to plan, manage and monitor building work has been introduced into the building regulations. The concept's been taken from health and safety law, and it's for all buildings, not just HRBs. And for all buildings, developers, applicants, contractors need to be able to explain not just what they're building, but also set out how they're doing it. And this need for coordination, cooperation, again goes back to the Grenfell inquiry, where it was found that everyone was working in silos, people weren't speaking to each other, and no one was taking responsibility for compliance. Although this is a requirement, as I say, across all buildings, the actual document here, a construction control plan, is HRB specific. So within high-rise buildings, there is a requirement to set out these various arrangements that have been taken for us as a regulator to assess in terms of the adequacy, and then to monitor to ensure they're implemented during the build phase. I've highlighted here on the side of my slide 2 documents which I think would be really helpful for those looking to develop these documents within HRBs or wider within all buildings. The first one is the Guidance on Collaborative Procurement, which sets out what I think some really helpful questions in terms of probing what management arrangements should be. And the second one is the CIOB RIBA Safety Critical Guide for Monitoring Arrangements, which this really sets out what monitoring should be and provides a benchmark for industry, but also for the regulator in terms of the adequacy of these arrangements. Next slide, please. And then finally, competence. Again, this is felt to be an underlying cause from Grenfell. Again, the competence requirements apply to all buildings. So the role of the client, the role of the principal contractor, the role of the principal designer, the designers are now part of the building regulations. So this is, as I say, repeating myself, this is across all buildings. And again, taken from health and safety law. And those of you familiar with the construction design and management regulations in health and safety, or CDM, will be aware these roles already exist from a health and safety sphere. And there's a real strong feeling that they've been very helpful in terms of the changing culture within health and safety. And it's hoped will have the same positive role within compliance with the building regulations. So again, there needs to be within the HRB setting actually some documentation around how competence will be managed, and specifically how the client will ensure the competence of the principal contractor and principal designer. And I'm conscious of time, so I'll finish there, but I'll give a shout out to the, although it's a bit blurry on my slide, to the PAS standards for the competence of principal designers and the PAS standard for the competence of principal contractor, because that's the key benchmark for assessing the competence of these 2 roles. And I think the HSC, the BSR, will be also producing some guidance to accompany and support them. But these 2 standards are really, really key. So I'm conscious of time, so I will finish there. I think this Q&A.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And if Rachel and Martin would like to come back on screen, please. Thank you all for the very interesting presentations. And as I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear, we've had a lot of questions. So I'll do my best to get us through as many of them as we can, but apologies to those who we aren't able to ask their questions, because obviously we do have a limited time. Actually, before we go on to the questions, Martin, there was a slight problem with a freeze between the main changes and the key messages. Would you just be able to repeat what you said in there, because I think some people didn't get it.
No, surely, yeah. Well, the key messages with the standard are that, as I said, it's due for publication next year. We're currently going through all the comments that we've received on both on the 2015 version and on the draft for public comment, the DPC. Nearly 2,000, 1,900 comments that we've got to go through. They've all got to be resolved. They've all got to be looked at. Otherwise, the standard can't be published. So that's the work that we're beavering away on at the moment. And of course, that sort of thing takes time. And just to reflect really that even whilst we're working on the drafting, we've got a changing landscape of fire safety in residential premises in the UK. We've had government announcements, we've had lots of new legislation. So we're constantly trying to respond to those events to make sure that when it's published, it is absolutely up to date and it reflects the state of the art in the UK, and it can be used in all the devolved nations of the UK. But there is still work to do, like the work on second staircases and unassisted use of evacuation lifts. But the 2024 version of the standard, when it's released, will reflect all that work, and we hope very much that people will use it.
Thank you for going back over that. So let's go on to some questions. I'll try and spread them around, make sure everyone has a chance to answer something. I will address the question to whoever is the most relevant person to lead, but everybody else, do please feel free to contribute as well if you have something you can add. I'll try and get an order of the presentations. Martin, so one attendee would be interested to know if the revised BS991 will say more on cluster accommodation, and in particular how it interacts with other residential accommodation and ancillary uses.
Oh goodness me, really testing my knowledge of the standard. Cluster accommodation. I can't recall in the meetings that I've been in that we've done an awful lot with cluster accommodation, to be honest. There might be colleagues that I have on the committee that are listening and saying, yes, we've done loads of stuff on that, and it's all completely changed. But I'm not sure that that's something that we've spent an awful lot of time looking at. If there are any comments that were received on cluster accommodation, then we will have addressed them in the final version.
Great, thank you. And then one for you. Given the proposed limitations on height of single stair conditions, is the drafting panel considering the use of pressurization in lieu of second stair?
In the current draft, there are differences in the recommendations for the second stair depending upon the introduction of certain fire protection measures. So, for example, you can go from X height to Y height if you have certain protections to the staircases, and pressurization might include those. Certainly, once we go over again certain trigger heights, and I'm deliberately not mentioning them because they could change in between now and publication, then pressurization will be a requirement. So in a way, the answer is yes. If you have pressurization amongst other things in the design of your premises, then there is going to be more flexibility in how many stairs that you have. But if we have baseline recommendations for the maximum height of single stair buildings, then if you want to use pressurization to justify variation from that standard, well, that's outside the scope of the standard, and you need to follow the relevant processes in order to be able to make that justification.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to one for Rachel now. So regarding accessibility, how well are cultural differences considered? For example, where English may not be the first language?
Oh, really good question. And yeah, it is one which we would cover off when taking kind of a more inclusive design approach and a more person-centered approach. English not being someone's first language, we'd look at under kind of communication and people communicating in different ways. So yes, English isn't someone's first language would be one of those areas. Also potentially people who communicate in different ways. British Sign Language users. So yeah, that is an area that we do highlight and provide some guidance on, and it is a really important area in terms of ensuring a safe and inclusive environment for everyone.
Thank you. And for a process one that I'm happy to help out with here, but somebody who is keen to take part in contributing to the draft for public comments, how do they do that?
I'm loving that keenness. I believe there's a link in the chat at the moment to this session to which people can follow if they want to contribute to the DPC. But Simon, happy to hand the baton across to you on the process side of things.
Apologies, apparently people are having difficulty hearing me. Is that any better? I'm going to carry on as if it is, and hopefully someone will let me know if they can't hear me. Yes, so that's correct. Drafts of public comment are made available for usually for 2 months. This is through our standards development portal, which is where I think the link will have sent people. We encourage as many people as possible to contribute. They are, as the name says, for public comment. They're not just for specialists. We welcome as many comments from as many people as we can, the more the better. And I think it's even possible if you register on the standards development portal to be notified when a standard goes out for public comment, so you know that it's there and you can contribute that way. So please do comment. We really appreciate it very much. Okay, so let's move on to some questions for Andrew. Front-end engineering design is a good approach, i.e. passive fire protection, as built documentation of fire and life safety are always an afterthought during the construction process. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think it sort of reframes the anecdote that I mentioned during my presentation around bringing in fire engineers at the end to solve problems that actually should be addressed right at the beginning. So, I mean, it's one of the key drivers for us to be front-loading all of the design considerations at Gateway 2 to prevent some of those issues and some of those conflicts that happens currently at the moment. So yeah, I would support that, and it is one of the key reasons that the regime is built the way it's built.
Thank you. Will private building control bodies now only be able to work and sign off small residential buildings? So
at the moment, the building control authority for high-rise buildings is going to be the BSR. Those in scope are residential buildings, so it doesn't include commercial civil buildings. And the BSR will be working through a multidisciplinary team, which means bringing in initially local authorities in the area to support the BSR. However, if there is no local authority support for a particular project, we will be calling on the private sector. So potentially private sector building control could still be working with the BSR in high-rise buildings if there isn't any local authority support for that particular project.
Okay, thank you for that. On completion of the project of a non-high-rise building, could you explain the reason for a requirement for a compliance declaration statement from the principal designer, and the principal contractor and the client?
Yeah, so compliance declaration. So I'm not necessarily sure about that terminology. So for a principal designer, they need to ensure across all buildings, so non-HRBs, that the the designs comply with the functional requirements of the building regulations, and the principal contractor needs to ensure that they're built to comply with the building regulations, and the client needs to make sure the arrangements are in place. Now, there is specific documentation, building regulations compliance documentation for HRBs, although I'm not aware of the that specific document for non-HRBs. I am aware that there is very clear duties on all of those parties to ensure that the design and the construction complies. So I think that's maybe a partial answer there, because I'm just not aware of that particular phrase.
Thank you. And then one question which I think maybe all of you might be able to contribute to. So the Morell and Day review had the terms of reference to examine how safety could be strengthened. In what respect is current British standards work specifically strengthening levels of safety in buildings? And what new standards work is planned for that aim? I might be able to help with that last part. But what are your thoughts on how standardisation is helping to strengthen levels of safety in buildings?
Should I go first as I'm speaking, and I'll pass over to colleagues? I mean, I think for me, a lot of the work on competence has been really helpful. I mean, I referenced the PASs around principal designer, principal contractor. There is the overarching flex standard as well, and there's other standards in the pipeline. So I think for me, lots of the work on competence to codify and to get some of those clear benchmarks through standards has been really helpful.
Shall I go next? From my point of view, standardisation is really important for various reasons. We've got lots of new legislation that we're currently picking our way through, and legislation, with the best will in the world, is written for lawyers and the courts. So it's really important that you have good technical guidance that goes along with the legislation to describe ways that tend to comply with the legislation. And that's one key role for some of the standards that we have in the fire area. And the other reason why they're important is they reflect the change in the state of the art. You know, what was acceptable 10 years ago, frankly, in a lot of areas isn't acceptable anymore. We're thinking about things in a new way for all sorts of reasons. Got new forms of construction coming in. There's new forms of motive power, for example, lots more lithium-ion batteries all over the place. And it's really important that standardisation picks that up. So those are the two key areas really to reflect the changing landscape and societal expectations for safety framed by legislation, and also to reflect new technologies and processes.
And I'd just add to Martin's answer there in terms of thinking about things in a new way and societal expectations as well. Adopting a more inclusive approach when looking at safety ensures that the diversity of the population and end users' requirements are incorporated and mainstreamed more. I think that's a really big change that's happened, I would say in the last 10 years, but probably more recently than that. And that's definitely the direction we're going with in terms of standards, and standardizing and mainstreaming that approach will really make a very big difference to a lot of people.
Thank you. And if I could just say a little bit about the work that we're doing. Of course, standards are developed by stakeholders. BSI brings together industry, academia, government, regulators, trade associations, professional bodies, as many people as we can, to get them around the table, often a virtual table nowadays, to work out what good looks like. So we have been conducting a program of engagement over the last year or so, both to consolidate our relationships with existing stakeholders, but also to try and make sure that we are including everybody. There may be groups that we've not been aware of in the past, or who haven't been able to participate. So we're trying to make sure that they are included. Of course, one group that we really want to see to hear the voice of is residents, and that's something we are making efforts to try and get, because in the past perhaps residents haven't had the voice they should have done. we're really trying to get them involved in the process of developing standards. What we're doing at the moment is also waiting for the government's response to the Burrell Day report, and of course it's not a more fixed report once the public inquiry has concluded. And as soon as we know what that report says, how the government is responding, then we will be able to set in place a programme of work. We know we're going to need to update many existing standards, and we may well need to develop new ones. And at that point, we'll know what that programme looks like. So I think that might actually be a convenient point to take our first break. A few minutes early, I know, but I'm sure people will appreciate a little bit more time to get some caffeine into the system. So Martin, Rachel, Andrew, thank you so much for your presentations and for your answers to the questions. We'll break now, and we will reconvene at 10:50 for the second session. So thank you, everybody. See you shortly.
Thanks.
Hello and welcome back. I hope everybody had a good break and is now feeling refreshed and ready for the second session. So now we have Dr. Peter Wilkinson, who is Trustee Director of the Institution of Fire Engineers and Director of Pyrology. And he is going to be speaking to us about competence. He's going to be followed by Aman Sharma, the Managing Director of Totus Digital, and Anne Kemp, Fellow and Technical Director of Atkins Realis, and they're going to be talking to us about BS 8644 Part 1, which is the standard on digital management of fire safety information, and helps to support the golden thread of information. And then Aman is going to continue, but on his own this time, and he is going to tell us about the introduction of a fire strategy standard. So with that, over to you, Peter.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction, Simon, and many thanks for inviting me to join this event. Today, I'm going to explore the thorny subject of competence for the fire engineer, but I'm going to be a bit selfish. And as someone who is really interested in how our profession started and how it and our institution has developed, I'm going to take a quick look back at discussions we've had about competence in the past. I'm going to revisit some of those key light bulb moments before talking about some future ideas. I'd like to begin with some wise words from one of the pioneers of the profession of fire engineering, and that's Margaret Law. Now, as many of you will know, Professor Law began her career as a scientist at the Fire Research Station, carrying out research into many aspects of fire behaviour and its effects on building materials and structures. She also became involved in the application of these research results in building regulations, codes of practice, and design guides. The application of research to solve practical problems was of particular interest to her, and so she joined Arup to act as an advisor on fire engineering projects being designed by the firm. Margaret's scientific work and her fire engineering work was and continues to be so influential. She believed profoundly in what she termed measurement. This belief drove her work, which was always founded on quantified scientific criteria and was always rigorously derived. So let's just spend a bit of time reflecting on Margaret's thoughts when answering the question, what is a fire engineer, in her 1990 conference paper, because her answers are really interesting. She boils it down to 6 characteristics. And she says, whatever their speciality, engineers have certain assumptions and background knowledge in common. They can discuss concepts across the frontiers of their speciality. The concept of flow, for example, whether it is water down a pipe, people down a corridor, electrical charges, and so on, these can be discussed directly or by analogy with ease. The physical and mechanical behaviour of materials and structures can be understood and discussed in a broad way. Engineers and architects too, by their education and training, have these concepts built into them and discuss matters accordingly. So here, Margaret is describing the fundamental engineering education. She goes on, measurement and quantification are fundamental to any proper engineering design. It is sad that so many people are reluctant to measure things. Presumably, this might cast doubts on what they know to be right. Now, because the fire danger and the effects of fire can generate deep emotions, the proposal to reduce such matters to cold numbers seems to be callous and not a proper response to the imponderable forces of nature. Yet decisions have to be made. So she says, my second point, therefore, is that a fire engineer must understand how to measure and quantify fire phenomena and fire safety. So I think Margaret is emphasising that fire engineers must be able to apply those prerequisite engineering principles to the fire phenomena, and that quantification is an important way of making comparisons or making decisions. Fire engineering is an important component of most activities. No one person could hope to be an expert across the board, she says. Nevertheless, the fire engineer should have an awareness of the various aspects, an ability to identify potential problem areas, and where to go to find an answer. I think this is self-explanatory. She's saying that fire engineering is a broad subject area, growing all the time. And as fire engineers, we must be aware of as much of it as we can and accept that we're not expert in it all. Experience as well as academic training is recognised as an essential part of engineering training, and this is just as important for fire engineers. The fire engineer should have the opportunity to gain practical experience, she said. Over the career of a fire engineer, there will be many changes, she predicted, in technology, lifestyle and knowledge, which need to be recognised and understood. For many aspects of fire safety, there is not yet the basis of an engineering design approach or enough accumulated practice on which a code of practice can be based. Therefore, it's particularly important that the fire engineer keeps ahead of the latest research and developments. I think we're good with that one. Then she goes on to say, finally, the fire engineer needs a certain toughness, she said, and I'm referring to intellectual toughness. By this, I mean the engineer must be able to be tested and challenged and deal with the matters in a rigorous, analytical, and above all, honest way. The fire engineer must be tough enough to stand up to a good deal of questioning and in turn be able to push other people in the same way. Justify what you are saying if you want to be taken seriously. So with this lecture, Margaret spells out what she sees as being key important attributes of a fire engineer. And I think we can all recognise these as competence, knowledge, experience and behaviours. She finishes off by asking, what makes this list different from other aspects of engineering? She answers herself by saying, nothing. Only with fire safety engineering, we have to spell it out. It is not yet taken for granted. Priceless. Now, I'm going to move swiftly on to some principles. And when I talk about principles, I'd like to highlight the principles that were set out in the work of Mostyn Bullock, Neil Butterworth and Adam Monaghan back in 2014, when they developed a series of articles which were published in the IFP journal. These are the titles, and I'd seriously recommend we all revisit these articles, make a note of these issue dates and find them on our website, read them, then record the time you've spent on your CPD log. It'll be invaluable exercise. Now, this series of articles were born out of the work of the IFE's Special Interest Group on Competency and Ethics. I'd like to focus for a very short while on the first of these papers, the development of competency in fire engineering. In it, Mostyn and Adam describe how and when IFE gained its Engineering Council licence and began registration activities in 1997. This is the Engineering Council's mission statement, and its reference twice to competence is no accident. And the paper reads, the timing was right. Design and construction in the built environment was in a period of significant change and relative well-being. Many large projects were underway or in the pipeline where design requirements demanded significant freedoms from the hitherto closely prescriptive approaches. The fire engineering profession flourished, and prospered in this environment. The time when fire engineering was principally the reserve of academics, scientists and insurance surveyors had passed. The rigorous process carried out by professional engineering institutions are designed to deliver the demanded standard of competency. Registered fire engineers are bound to work under the code of conduct of both the IFE and as a condition of membership, and the Engineering Council as a condition of registration. Who can argue with the sense of that? It would therefore seem obvious to expect that practicing fire engineers are competent, the paper reads. Wouldn't it? Well, the paper continues. The profession can do all it can to produce fire engineers of the highest caliber, but the domain in which these engineers operate presents serious challenges to competent and ethical practice that cannot be ignored. This domain isn't just the technical nuts and bolts of fire, rather it is those aspects of professional conduct which relate more to ethical practice in fire engineering project management. This is great stuff. Another aspect mentioned in their paper starts, it's also crucial to recognise the thing that sets fire engineering apart from the majority of other engineering disciplines in the built environment. And that's that fire is an accidental loading condition, i.e. there's a significant probabilistic aspect to its application. Whereas other areas of design, such as structural, acoustic and thermal performance, are all normal day-to-day service conditions. We have to be honest with ourselves to acknowledge that this can lead to an apathetic approach to fire safety, or the perceived need to engage a competent fire safety professional being given second billing in comparison to more pressing concerns. It's gripping stuff and so relevant. Now, Neil presented a summary of this work in our 2015 conference. In his presentation, he talked about the Engineering Council's UK spec objective known as E5 about ethics. The Statement of Ethical Principles sets a standard to which members of the engineering profession should aspire in their working habits and relationships. The values on which it is based should apply in every situation in which professional engineers and technicians exercise their judgment. And Neil highlighted fundamental principles running through the 4 pillars of the statement. And these 4 pillars are accuracy and rigour, honesty and integrity, respect for life, law and the public good, and responsible leadership. So what Neil was doing, in my mind, was setting out ethical behaviour as an integral part of competence and essential in achieving competent fire engineering. I'm pleased to say that the critically important foundations that the Competency and Ethics SIG led to strengthening of the Code of Conduct for members and registrants. It led to the IFE whistleblowing policy and guidance and the establishment of the institution's Ethics Committee. I'm also pleased that building on the Statement of Ethical Principles that was established by the Engineering Council and the Royal Academy of Engineering, the group published a report called Engineering Ethics, Maintaining Society's Trust in the Engineering Profession. And this builds on those principles and proposes actions and appropriate regulation that will achieve a more ethical culture in UK's engineering profession. At its heart is the need to ensure that the public has confidence and that the profession acts ethically. The report reminds us, though, that inevitably there are tensions between profitability, sustainability and safety that engineers seek to be aware of and need to balance. However, there have been some important questions posed in recent years, and social media has amplified that public scrutiny. The report cites Dame Judith Hackett's review of the building regulations and fire safety following the Grenfell Tower tragedy, when she highlighted that there was a cultural issue across the construction sector, which can be described as a race to the bottom caused either through ignorance, indifference, or because the system does not facilitate good practice. Right, moving swiftly on, I'd like to introduce a bit of work. Dr. Angus Law, who's a BRE lecturer in fire safety engineering at the University of Edinburgh. Now, he was asked to chair a meeting on competency in June 2018 by the Industry Response Group. Now, another good quotation, and Angus quoted Confucius. He said, real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. And he also cited work by Kruger and Dunning from 1999. Are you confident because you have knowledge, or are you confident because you have no knowledge? Now, the purpose of this aside was to make the point that one of most important aspects of competence is that of the assessment of self-competence, but it also the inherent difficulty of doing this, because the lack of competence can give the illusion of competence. It's often those with least competent consider themselves to be most competent. Now, Angus introduced the concepts of specific competence. Particular professions will have the specific competence that only that profession can have, and only that profession can assess, e.g. specific fire engineering skills. He also talked about common competence, competencies that are common across professions, e.g. professional ethics, and also interdependencies, and their competencies required by one profession by another profession. He stated that a professional institution, by definition, should have a monopoly on a given activity. A fire engineer can only be assessed by a fire engineer. This work was summarised in a report that was submitted to Dame Judith's work and set out 3 principles, which was the kickstart for the work which led to Flex, BSI Flex 8670. Flex 8670, that's core criteria for building safety competence frameworks code of practice. It was published in April 2021 and was created in response to findings from the Hackett Review, which highlighted a fragmented approach to and a lack of consistency in the processes and standards for assuring the competence of those working on buildings as a major flaw in the previous regulatory system. And accordingly, Flex 8670 provides a set of core principles of competence, including leading and managing safety, communicating safety, delivering safety, risk management, regulations and processes, building systems, ethics, fire and life safety. So what's the common theme with Margaret Law, the principles outlined so well by Mostyn, Adam and Neil, and the work from Angus Law, the Royal Academy of Engineering's work, and Flex 8670? Well, I see it as this. Amongst other things, being competent is a combination of acquiring knowledge, practicing experience, and living by appropriate behaviours. I think as an institution and as a profession, we've known this for some time. For me, the important element of all this is the behavioural aspect. It's about taking personal responsibility. Competence isn't something you can expect your professional body to do to you. You have to live it, show it, and importantly, if you're acting as a professional, you have to be able to demonstrate it. And I'm also pleased that in response to a proposal in Dame Judith Hackett's independent review, the Engineering Council has developed and has now published a version of their UK Standard for Professional Engineering Competence and Commitment, known as UK Spec, contextualised for higher risk buildings. So UK Spec HRB is a new standard from the Engineering Council that sets out the competencies and the commitments expected for engineers and technicians who work in the built environment sector, in particular on higher risk buildings. It's been contextualised for engineers and technicians involved in building work, including design, construction, maintenance and operation. It incorporates those core criteria for building safety set out in Flex 8670. An assessment to UK Spec HRB and admission to the Engineering Council's HRB register provides assurance to building owners and occupants that an engineer or technician is competent to carry out work that complies with building regulations, is committed to practicing ethically and in accordance with their professional engineering institution's code of conduct. I'm delighted that IFE is licensed to register professional engineers to the fire discipline annex of UK Spec HRB, and we'll be hearing more about that in the new year. So I appreciate we've covered a lot here in a short period of time. We've looked back at some of the discussions, developments and strides that our profession was taking historically, specifically regarding competence, and we're mindful that successful fire safety within the built environment is a collaborative and cooperative effort. And thank you very much. After that, I'm going to hand you on to our next speaker.
Thanks, Peter. Always a difficult act to follow, but I'm going to give it a try nonetheless. I'm grateful to BSI for inviting myself and a very good friend and colleague in Dr. Anne Kemp to come and update you all this morning on some of the work that we have been taking forward with our friends and colleagues at NEMA following the publication of BS 8644 Part 1 in August of last year. Before I do, just a very short introduction on my role within all of this. I currently and have been chairing the technical committee responsible for the 8644 series, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what our next steps are for that particular programme of work and how a subsequent programme of work will invariably interlink with that. But before we do, and certainly not to drive home the point unnecessarily, because it is very necessary to revisit the elements of why we come together to discuss the drive and the commitments that we are making to our discipline moving forward. And Andrew touched upon this in good detail earlier on. We are here because of those significant life loss events that we have seen across our built environment, typified by the most catastrophic example in the Grenfell Tower tragedy. In Dame Judith's independent review, it is conscious and cognizant to remind ourselves of her recommendation for a golden thread of information. And this is something that all on the call will be deeply familiar with now, not least because of the introduction of the new regime for design, construction and operation of higher risk buildings, but also those nuances and amendments to practices that we will see cascaded across the whole of the built environment. But for the purposes of this particular part of today's agenda, where we are focusing on information management, in particular digital information management, a reminder that the genesis for this idea of a golden thread very much was embedded within the interim report that Dame Judith published in late 2017 and chapter 8, where she introduced the idea for a golden thread. And as we move on to the next slide, we will see and start to just remind ourselves a little bit about what 8644 actually was. We incepted the project almost in the immediacy, really. The project was officially started in between the publication of Dame Judith's interim report and the publication of her final report. So it sort of crossed over between December 2017 and the spring of 2018. And what we knew we wanted to do at that time was start to develop something that we refer to as a standard information approach for fire safety information. We knew that we had not done particularly well in trying to introduce a simple and recognizable way to manage fire safety information throughout the life cycle of assets in a built environment, notwithstanding existing regulatory requirements to do so, of course, as a function of Regulation 38 and 16B preceding that. So what does that mean? It meant that we had a legal requirement to do this. And what Dame Judith had identified, worryingly, was that we had as an industry just not been doing that particularly well, which was problematic. So in response to Dame Judith's very consistent call for industry to own the guidance that it is working to, craft the solutions and not sort of dance around the issues, 8644 was born. It is and always has intended to be a multi-part series. So the official title of the document published last year is 864 Part 1. And that's as a recognition of the need to introduce what I call a step change protocol to this. We are not trying to reinvent an information management wheel here. and hence why our friends and colleagues at NEMA have begun to support this programme of work. Information management and processes that we describe in the relevant standards, which we'll explore in a bit more detail shortly, is not something that we think needed to be novel as it crossed over into the fire engineering discipline. But it's the primary purpose of the Part 1 standard is to introduce those first stepping stones. It's to begin the thinking of how we incorporate some of those existing processes that we associate, in particular with the BSE and ISO series, you can see in the bottom there, and how that coalesces with the UK BIM framework and the existing information management mandate. The last point I will just make on this slide is that the British standard itself is a code of practice, and it's been purposefully crafted as a code of practice, such to allow contextual application on different projects, schemes, developments, etc. It's not a prescriptive methodology to apply a blanket process to the delivery of an information management framework for fire safety information. So if we can move on to the next slide. We'll quickly discuss Annex A. So Annex A, relatively sort of not overly novel. This has been done in other British standards and other houses, of course, but on purchasing of 8644 Part 1, the lucky buyer then also gets a set of downloads which form the template for Annex A. And readers and those who have become very familiar with 8644 will know that we describe information exchange points, all contained within a fire safety information management framework. What we thought would be a very helpful first step for users of the standard to do would be to have some form of guiding template to be able to structure information in a specific way, fire safety information, in a very specific way that could map across back to said framework. And one of the mechanisms that we developed to deploy this was something called FIRE, simply a very simple idea of an information exchange database for fire safety information. Now that caused some reaction within primarily the BIM community for its crossover with some of the concepts and principles discussed within COBie, and understandably so. Change management at this scale is a very, very difficult beast to manage, so to speak. But the primary readership of this standard is absolutely the fire safety community, and what we wanted to do was introduce, as I've said earlier on, stepping stones to be able to get to a point where we could have the all important standard information approach. So what we were not trying to do was create a fire safety information version of COBie. I think that was something that was misinterpreted by a number within the community at large. But what we absolutely needed to do, clearly following some of the feedback received on publication, was develop that thinking, and that was absolutely part of the original intent to do when we first sat down to flesh out what this thing called 8644 will and should be, and hence why the decision was made to have it as a multi-part series and not as a standalone document. So if we can move on to the next slide. I'm really pleased after conversations with the senior leadership at what was the UK BIM Alliance, now of course NEMA, that we had an agreement to set up a NEMA fire safety working group to look at some case studies, undertake a review against those requirements that are cross-mapped against the BSE and ISO 19650 series, and looking at things like the purpose for fire safety information, the level of information need, and any attributes, notwithstanding the excellent presentation from Peter previously, what are some of those key skills that will need to be taken forward and added to the repertoire of a fire engineer to be able to operate in that space. We're incredibly conscious that we're bridging two very separate but purposeful disciplines here. The work is being conducted at pace, I have to say, through NEMA by some of the leaders that you would associate with information management, but also fire safety engineering expertise as well. And we have a programme of significant stakeholder engagement, which will see a consultation form a parcel that will take place once the first crux of the work has been completed. The final point I'll just make on this is that I've made an absolute commitment, which I intend to firmly stand by, is that the outputs from the NEMA Fire Safety Working Group will absolutely come back into FSB 111, which is the technical committee responsible for the 8644 series, for consideration at the revision date of 8644, and we are already starting to begin what the programme phasing looks like based on the assumptions that we'll receive that information at key dates. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I think this is my last slide before I'll introduce and pass over to Anne. We've had, I think, very candid and honest conversations about some of those existing challenges, but also those solutions that are forthcoming that we want to be able to take into a revised part 1 and a subsequent part 2, and possibly even a part 3 on review when the publication then goes through that process. A revisit of Annex A, notwithstanding those items that we've just previously discussed, but also the purpose of that schema that I referred to earlier on. How do we operationalize at scale FIRE? What are the missing pieces that need to take the concept of FIRE, which we've seen implemented through various case studies in its existing form, but where we know we want to take this in the future, we are absolutely recognizing the fact that we need to create a few more jigsaw pieces to pull together. So the work of the Fire Safety Working Group and under NEMA is identifying what that is, and it's highly likely at this point in time, highly likely that FIRE and the concepts and principles will exist within its own part of the 8644 series, which will bring together that next step and that next stage of information that will help deliver this at scale. The last bullet point is a really important one for me. It speaks to some of the behavioural and cultural practices that we associate ourselves within this space, and it's something that's been discussed for a couple of items that we have seen in the agenda previously or early this morning, and it's what are the appropriate messages and practices, and also the behaviours that we want to encourage to be able to embed this. We know what we are trying to achieve here. That much is obvious. It's why I make a point of reminding audiences why we are sat having these conversations in the context of the backdrop of Grenfell. But we need to make sure that when we are having challenging conversations and critical conversations about what good looks like in this space and others, that they are reflective of the behaviours that we are expecting industry to repeat back to us, either as standard makers or regulators or members of approval authorities, etc., etc. We know that we are all working for the same purpose, and so divisiveness and dissent is not overly helpful. So on that very critical last point, I have great pleasure in passing over to Dr. Kemp, who will take us through the rest of the slides. Anne.
Okay, thank you very much, Aman. So critically then, the stakeholders. What we want to be doing is to include very much the fire safety and the wider building safety communities. So we really are focusing, for instance, on the Institute of Fire Engineering and Fire Safety Managers, Institute of Fire Prevention Officers, National Fire Chiefs Council. Some of you may be saying, well, we haven't heard from you yet, and that is true. We are trying to move at pace. We have been a little bit hit with ill health and work pressures. This is, I would like to emphasise, voluntary work done by a team of now a dozen people, drawn from both the fire safety but also the information management community as well. And I would say that it's taken a little while to really get people to come together, to listen deeply, to shift their opinions and start to get to consensus and to, I think, an outcome which will be useful right the way across. So let me explain why, in fact, Aman came to NEMA. NEMA relaunched this time last year, actually a month in October, from the UK BIM Alliance to be NEMA. And it's no accident that NEMA in Greek actually means thread. And what we're talking about here with building safety regulations and fire safety is that golden thread that Judith Hackett was referring to. What NEMA is ultimately aiming for is a thriving and sustainable built and natural environment, which is integrated, but it's been transformed by exploiting purpose-driven data. And what I'd like to emphasize is this is not managing information for the sake of it. It has to be driven by purpose. It has to be driven by the people who desperately need that information to be able to trust it, to know that it's safe to use through whole life. So very much the elements which were picked out by Judith, but previous speakers have also referred to, including Andrew from the Building Safety Regulator. So just briefly to tell you a little bit more about NEMA, there are 3 goals which we have. One is to provide leadership across the UK BIM framework, and we work in partnership with the British Standards Institution on that. Part of that role is to actually look after the ISO 19650 series, which I am the convener of, and it's about to go through a ballot for systematic review. And one of the things I really want to be watching is what comes out of this work that we should really be bringing into the 19650 series as well. So this is about both communities learning from each other. It's not about the information management communities telling the fire safety what to do. It's we need to really listen and learn what your needs are going forward. But fundamentally, we do want to help to drive a data-centric attitude to the built environment, so that we're getting away from data being locked in documents, paper documents and paper drawings, but you're actually confident that when you need that information, it is available to you in the right form that you understand and can use. So finally, the really important goal for us is to inform, collaborate, add value, and learn from other transformation initiatives such as this. So we're really grateful and humbled to be asked to be involved in this work. So the scope, I think, is really important for us all to remember. It is about the focus on what good looks like, providing the principles and the guidance on what the recommended next steps should be for the BS 8644 series. But again, we can't command that. That's exploring it with Oman and the committee, what is required of the 8644 series. So priority is to ensure that that work and resulting recommendations are targeted at and understandable to fire experts. That's fundamental. It's not about the IM experts. We can guide and say what's sensible, but it has to land right with fire experts. Ultimately, however, I'm very, very clear that it's for the BSI committee, FSB 111, to implement the recommendations for revising and for further developing the standard. So the purpose of the IS 19650 series is to set out a structured approach which can standardise the methodology for managing information within the delivery of wider asset and project requirements, so the building safety regulations, fire safety. It shouldn't be being done as a thing to deliver on its own. If we're only managing information for the sake of it, we've failed. I'm very clear on that. So what we've got to, right across the built environment, although there is certainly progress, is there has been stuck with information locked in reports and drawings. Some of this is what we can see with that a magic roundabout of buck passing that was referred to earlier, is that people were saying, but we don't know where the information is, we don't know how to obtain it. That is actually understandable. It's also that it's not secure, it's very vulnerable, it's not necessarily in a form that can be easily understood and drawn out to inform whether it be emergency responders, whether it be the fire engineers, what actually is required for the decision making. So the aim of the ISO 19650 series is to help ensure that data and information is unlocked and is discoverable within essentially a single point of truth, if you like. So, and these could be provided by a number of different technologies. Wouldn't it be lovely if you were actually able to, for instance, the plumbers and the MEP engineers to be able to access data through their iPhones, which they knew was trustworthy. And when they were making changes with refurbishments or maintenance, that data could actually be immediately uploaded. So you'd know what the impact of a maintenance step was and what the implications could be from a fire safety perspective. But then the important thing is that it can then be published in a number of different ways, an infinite number of ways, if you like, designed specifically for the end user. So from this perspective, it's really, I think, what was aimed for with FIRE is, well, how could we actually deliver data that could then be published in different ways, which is helpful to the fire safety professions. So what we get to here then is liberated data, but it's not a free-for-all. It's not like your unstructured data. What's important is that what it's delivering is that it's trusted data where great things can then happen. So what we really need to do is to find out from the fire engineers, very much focused with the BS 8644, what is unique for you in this context. But don't require it in a different form. If it's already been provided for, let's ensure that actually the structure, the way that it's being created, delivered, surveyed, is actually compatible with the needs of the fire safety engineers. This is really important because otherwise we're recreating, we're surveying, we're duplicating efforts that have gone before. We may lose the knowledge from the design that Andrew was referring to earlier, which is absolutely critical for somebody who's doing a refurbishment. He needs to know what the design intent and the performance requirements were originally, what that building is designed for as a high rise. So in a sense, it's quite straightforward. It's common sense. As we go through with the fire engineers, we're identifying the need. What is the problem statement? So what is the question that you need addressing? And this will inform what the requirements for the information is, the level of information that's needed. So what's the existing approach to defining assets and information? Let's not be scared of that. If it's still a report, well, what is the information buried in that report which is unique and you need to use for your decision making? So what we need to do in helping this is to really understand who all the stakeholders are. So we then get a complete picture of everything that's required. We need to understand how the work is being procured and carried out. Are there any loopholes which actually prevent that information landing in the right way? Identifying how the information has been developed, how it will be exchanged and used, what systems are being used, are they compatible? Can we actually move the data between those systems? And then demonstrating how the information is used through whole life. Are there any blockers to information which has been provided through the design to being used within a fire safety context? Is the level of information needed changing with that different context? So the work is underway. And there's work which has been published on the UK BIM framework website, which is being reviewed. But these are useful links, which I won't go through right now, but you're very welcome to go and have a look. The first is a video which actually explains the context of what I'm really talking about, is that you will have a unique set of information that you are requiring. But that can actually be put within the wider set of information for the whole of that building, which will be needed uniquely for the construction process, for the people who are actually living in that building. So, but what it is that if that information's already been collected, it's identified that you also need it. But if there's also information that is unique to you, that then also can be collected at the point that you request it. Ultimately then, you're not duplicating or asking the supply chain to provide you with a unique, extensive list of information which is duplicated and has already been delivered elsewhere, which introduces inefficiencies, but also then ambiguity about where the information can be found. So it really can be a filter, and it can be a way to discover the information that you need and you can trust to make your decisions. So UK BIM framework, do feel that you can go and have a look at that. It has all of the standards from ISO 19650 that is required, but also guidance and the resources for which I've just provided the links. So thank you very much for listening. NEMA are here to help, to listen, to understand what your needs are. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with me if there's anything you feel that I can assist with. At this point, I'll now hand back to Aman, who will continue his discussion about the new British standard on fire strategies. Thank you.
Thanks, and it is actually somewhat of a purposeful segue as well. So keen readers of 8644 will have noticed within the foreword that we referred to in 8644 Part 2, which was initially earmarked for the development and management of fire strategies, notwithstanding that inherent and purposeful strategic objective to try and bring together information management and fire engineering as two very specific disciplines. But much has changed since then, as we've just learned and discovered and continue to discover. And I'm really pleased to be able to announce formally for the first time in public that we have now convened and had the inaugural meeting of something called FSH 1411 to develop a new British standard for the development and use of fire strategies. Now, just a bit of background before we do, we as fire engineers and most within the fire safety community will recognise that for fire safety design, fire strategies are the primary vehicle that we will associate ourselves with, which I think is very curious, really, when we recognise that there's no specific regulatory underpinning for that. It's something that's happened quite organically, certainly not so much as a fire risk assessment or now a fire emergency file, but this is something that us as fire engineers and the wider fire safety community have become all the more familiar with over the previous years that we have been acting as fire safety engineers within our discipline. However, recently we have seen this trend for that deliverable carrying over from what has been principally a design document into something that I think we're mostly, all of us now becoming a bit familiar with, and this idea of having a retrospective fire strategy. So the idea of going into an existing building or an asset of some description and developing a fire strategy which captures the as is. And that will be predominantly because something wasn't done at detailed design and construction phasing to hand over a fire strategy on completion of that construction phasing for that particular building. And I think it's right that we recognise that there are inherent differences between a design fire strategy, a construction phase fire strategy, and what this idea of what I would prefer to call an occupation or fire strategy, not occupation as opposed to a retrospective one, but certainly recognising that is the vernacular being used in the industry at the moment. And we also know, lastly, that the introduction of the new building control regime for high risk buildings in particular does bring into focus the value of having a fire strategy, not least because I think the guidance that's been produced by the PSR already points to the fact that those new fire safety deliverables, in particular your fire and emergency file, need to have an inherent link to your fire strategy. So the thing has to be there in the first place for it to be able to do that. And I think that matters all the more so for those activities that are captured through the fire and construction phases. So very quickly, as we move on to the next slide, just to continue a bit about the background, we did, of course, have a PAS for the development of fire strategies. It wasn't a particularly well-known or well-adopted PAS, which is why it's, of course, now withdrawn. Followers of the Grenfell Tower inquiry will recognise that PAS 911 was cited quite specifically. However, this PAS, having been published in 2007, hadn't been subject to a review, I think predominantly because the sponsor of the PAS originally went into administration and discontinued its business operations. However, what was crystal clear to those of us who were convened to discuss what the future of PAS 911 should be was that we needed to think about this being uplifted into a British standard. And actually what we're doing is we're not taking the PAS itself and turning it into a British standard, but rather we're starting again, recognising that the world has moved on quite significantly since PAS 911 was produced. Although I am keen to adopt some of the good learning concepts and principles from 911 into the British standard where we can. Invariably, the new standard, we hope, will demonstrate what good looks like for the development and management of a fire strategy. Again, throughout the life cycle of a building, we're trying to discourage this thinking that fire strategies are simply for design activities only, and I think that will play a very big part in sort of delivering against the BSR's objective of trying to get fire engineering engagement at the earliest opportunity, and we're doing that now, of course, with planning and planning gateway 1. But we want to make sure that that's going in the opposite end of the life cycle of a building into operation and demolition, of course, as well. So as we move into the penultimate slide, I'm happy to share with you some of the strategic objectives very recently agreed with the new panel. And it is a very fresh panel. I was quite keen to bring in some new voices and some new perspectives, and certainly that has resulted in some very good outputs to this day, and the first of which you can see here. So I've asked the panel to set a number of strategic objectives, which will primarily act as drafting principles for the document itself. These will be the, if you like, the curriculum through which the document will be developed. What do we want this document to do? The number one there, we want to promote that life cycle approach to the development and management of fire strategies, as I've covered already, and I think Anne touched upon in some detail too. We want to enable that consistent process for the development of fire strategies, which ultimately will lead to a better quality of fire strategies. We think it's desperately important to focus on the end users of our buildings. I think we've heard that quite consistently throughout the regulatory reform process that we've all been a part of in recent years. And we want to make sure that that focus on end users and consumers drives the development process of fire strategy, recognizing who we're building and designing and constructing these buildings for, and building those principles in and around those individuals. We want to make sure also that the terminology and language should be consistent with the relevant standards. And of course, there's been a plethora of activity in fire safety standards recently. We want to make sure that those references are communicative and recognizable as users of standards should be across the piece, in the same way that I hope that everyone does with regulation, of course, as well. I'm looking across the multitude of secondary and primary regs when they are undertaking their disciplines. And then lastly, we want to consider those new and emerging skills relevant to fire engineering. And the obvious one, of course, is information management. So you can see why there is a very clear connection between the work of not just FSB 111, but obviously other emerging disciplines that we would associate with fire engineering as well. I'm also pleased to, lastly, before I hand back to Simon, to share some very high-level dates with you. And I'm embracing my inner civil servant, I'm afraid, when I'll be fast and loose with the timeline dates. We have officially incepted this project. It's live, it's underway, it's happening, and that's a good thing. I'm really pleased that we were able to do this prior to the end of the calendar year. We have a planned consultation over the spring, summer of 2025, which gives my committee a good headway to be able to develop that first draft so that such that it is ready. A draft public consultation with a plan to produce the first draft for publication in winter 25 or spring 26. So that's a standard timeline for most British standard development, but the very good news is that we've got some very good existing practices that we can lean on, as all British standards should be doing anyway, that are informing the basis of that first draft. And the very last thing that I'll do is make a very similar offer that Anne has made at the end of her presentation, is that I want to hear from people that can actively contribute to this programme of work. I have absolutely no intent to be adding onto the committee such that we have an over prescribed resource, but any engagement that I can do, any engagement that my committee can be doing to enable the development process, I absolutely intend to take advantage of. So please get in touch if there's something that you feel that you can add, or there's something you feel that is desperately important to be considered by the committee as we undertake our work. And with that, I will pass back to Simon. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alan. And great, Peter is back on camera. And Anne, if you could join as well, that would be great. And hopefully now my sound problems have been sorted out, so everyone can actually hear me properly. Apologies for that. You'd think after 3 years of virtual calls and the like, I'd have got it sorted out, but at least I wasn't actually on mute. So let's start with some questions. I'm waiting now for a message from somebody telling me they still can't hear me. Let's start with the questions. One for you, Peter, to begin with, please. Will chartered fire engineers be able to work on high-risk buildings, or will all fire engineers need to pass the new competence criteria for HRBs?
Well, first of all, technically speaking, the title Chartered Fire Engineer doesn't exist. That's because the Institution of Fire Engineers doesn't have a charter to give that designation. We are chartered engineers, and we've been chartered via the Institution of Fire Engineers. But to answer the point about working on higher risk buildings, if you are already chartered and if you are working within the higher risk buildings environment, then I would recommend that registration via the Engineering Council's contextualised registration is a really good way of demonstrating your competence to do so. And we just have to be mindful that in the future, the regulator is going to be taking a keen interest in the project teams that are assembled for a variety of projects that will be taking place within the higher risk buildings regime, whether that's feasibility, design, actual construction of the buildings, and that larger part of the building life cycle, that when they're in use, and having that registration is an excellent way of demonstrating to the regulator that the team assembled have the correct competences in place. So I would recommend it, yes.
Thank you, Peter. And one that's related, I think, which is what's the best way to ensure competence for those who need to engage specialists?
The best way to ensure competence membership. Being able to demonstrate it is a great way. Being able to demonstrate it to your clients, and membership of your discipline's professional body is a good way of doing that. Your professional body will judge your knowledge, experience, and behaviours in an appropriate way. So that's the first part of it. Once you're a member of a professional engineering institution, you'll be expected to maintain your knowledge, maintaining your continuing professional development is a key part of being competent and demonstrating it. And I would also encourage specialist registration with the Engineering Council as well as an additional way of doing that. One of the important parts of this contextualised registration scheme is the revalidation element to it. I think this is a fundamental change that is absolutely needed. Personally, I became a chartered engineer with IFE back in 2005, and I've not been challenged on my technical knowledge since then. I think it's absolutely right that if we say we are competent, we should be able to demonstrate that and keep demonstrating it when challenged, and with the revalidation that's necessary for the contextualised registration, that's likely to be every 5 years.
Thank you, Peter. Now, the questions for Anna, I don't know.
Simon, I think we've just got the buzzing back a bit there. You might just need to reinsert your headphones again quickly.
Right. Is that better now? Great. Right, Anna, I shall come to you now. So BS8644 refers to data to be used by the fire safety community who is seen as being the main members of that community, and what type of data is seen as being within and outside the scope.
So I'll take that one first, if I may, and then Anne may wish to add to it. I think there are multiple consumers, users of information across the built environment, irrespective of what your role is when interfacing with the built environment. So this is why in the very last part of the presentation I referred to residents and consumers in particular, because they are individuals that have very little, if nothing, to do with the design and construction of the buildings. They ultimately then end up having the most to lose if something hasn't been thought through or go wrong. But the information that should have and will go on to be captured that will help enable the building safety for that particular building is a commodity that they need to be able to interface with. And I think that's at one extreme, Simon, in terms of an example of, putting the data part of your question to one side for the time being, who the profile of such a user or someone who would require some form of interface with that information would be. But the other might be in the context of design specifically, colleagues within your design team. And something that comes across quite strongly, I think, in the literature that we've seen, the multiple, body of literature that we've seen since the SADP until the 14th of June 2017, is that lack of holistic thinking during design, whereby our structural colleagues may not have been speaking to fire engineering colleagues as closely or as early as they should have been. The same with MEP, the same with the architects, and so on and so forth. They are also users, and they are also individuals and teams that require subsets of relevant fire safety information to inform the part of their design as well. So without sort of being too blanket with my answer, I think it's one of the main concepts and principles from 8644 is to encourage the user and the adopter of those principles to answer that question for themselves when they're looking at the fire safety information management framework, and set out who needs to see the stuff that I'm producing and who needs to inform its development subsequently as well. Do we have the right people here? Do they understand what we're trying to achieve? And that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve with the completion of this particular project, but also with the subsequent design phases as well. So I'll pass on to Anne, she's got the other.
I think you've answered that pretty comprehensively, Aman. I think that the only thing I would like to say is that there are existing ways of framing what information is required right the way across the whole life of infrastructure and buildings. And what we're wanting to test and challenge ourselves on is, are there elements from a fire safety, building safety regulation perspective, which are unique, which haven't yet been introduced into that. But what would be helpful is if it's with
Hello and welcome back. I hope suitably refreshed after your lunch break and ready for the final session in today's fire conference. We're now going to hear from Nick Miller, Managing Director of the Lift and Escalator Industry Association, on evacuation lift standards, and specifically the updates to EN 81 Part 76, which is about the evacuation of persons with disabilities using lifts. Then Brett Egan-Byers, the National Technical Advisor for PPE for the National Fire Chiefs Council, is going to tell us about the challenges facing firefighters' PPE. And then to round the day off, David Matthews, Managing Director of Fire and Industrial PPE, will tell us about the updates to the SEN and ISO PPE standards. So with that, over to you, Nick.
Simon, thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
I've had I've had connection challenges as well. Good. Well, it's now afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the welcome, Simon. And I think I'm picking up really on some excellent stuff earlier from Martin with the background to the work on BS 9991, and also very much on some of the material Rachel shared. So before we go any further, in terms of what the new benchmarks are looking like, we should just touch on what the existing evacuation benchmarks are. Essentially, we've got BS 9999, and in Annex G, we have a description, a very simple description of an evacuation lift that's intended for managed evacuation. And in some form or other, that's been around now since at least as far back as BS 5588 Part 8 1988. So that's 35 years now. And as far as I'm aware, Annex G of BS 9999 is the only description of an evacuation lift in British standards. So that's the beastie we've got. And we'll move on in a moment to look at what potentially what we might have in the future. The other standard I just want to mention while we're talking about current benchmarks is another standard called BS 8899, which deals with improvement of existing lifts for firefighting and for evacuation. So I mean that's perhaps a less well-known document, but I think it's important just to make you aware of that if you weren't already. So with here, I mean, it's no surprise, it's no spoiler that we're talking about a new standard coming along, which when published will be EN 8176, and Martin and Rachel very well have touched on some of the drivers for that. But I just really wanted to go over, you know, some of the quickly review on some of the guidance and drivers for what we're seeing as being a need to provide lifts for the independent evacuation of people who need level egress. Martin's already given an excellent background and introduction on BS 9991, and also mentioned the commenting phase. When a British standard is revised, as everybody I hope now knows, there's this public commenting stage, which is absolutely crucial to the development of the standard. And there were many comments submitted in relation to the need to include something to help evacuation for those needing you know, level egress. There's also a document that I guess Rachel's very well aware of, EN 17210, also very much signposts this need for independent evacuation. And of course, I think people are aware of the London Plan and the policy D5B5. And then there's another sort of bucket that I've just lumped a load of other things, building users' expectations post-Grenfell. I think there's an expectation post-Grenfell that this is a problem that really needs to be fixed, you know, by our community. So work is underway on two projects, two documents that we should discuss. The first is this drafting of a European evacuation lift standard, EN 8176. I'm going to refer to it as EN 8176, but of course it's not yet published. And we're hoping for publication in 2024. The end stop for that publication is actually shown on the SEN system as early October, but I'm very much hoping that it will be significantly earlier than that. And in parallel, somehow, we've got this work on the revision of BS 9991. And again, as Martin mentioned earlier, hopefully publication next year. So these two projects are somehow running in parallel, but they're not directly connected with each other. But however, there is a linkage, and I'm just going to go on to the next slide to try and explain that linkage. So how might a new evacuation lift standard, a new European evacuation lift standard, how might that help? Well, I've included there the title of it. And the interesting thing is that as we've seen the draft and as we expect the standard to be published next year, it will include 3 options. And the idea is that standards such as BS 9991 or a revised 9999 in the future could select one of those options or indicate which options should be used. So it's very much a toolkit approach being taken with EN 8176. And those options, there's 3 options. The first is a kind of driver-assisted evacuation. So this is someone taking control of the lift, much as they would do with a BS 9999 type evacuation lift. So we kind of know it and love it. We've used it for a long time. Something which is quite new and which I'll touch on in a bit more detail is something called automatic evacuation. This maybe gives the prospect of leaving a lift in an automatic evacuation operation rather than it being taken over by a rescue team. So the idea there is that it would recall, once in evacuation mode, it would any existing passengers would be taken to the exit floor and released, and after that the lift would then do a kind of simple evacuation operation where it would shuttle between the floor where it could see the highest priority call for evacuation and then shuttle and go back to the exit floor. The lift would not serve car calls, and the idea there is that it shouldn't be taking people back into the building or allowing normal circulation through the building. Finally, there's something called remote operation. Time is quite short today. I'm not going to talk very much more on that. Perhaps in the future we'll have a chance to revisit when the standard is published. But I alluded just earlier that there is a kind of linkage between the work going on for a European evacuation lift standard and work in the UK on BS 9991, and the linkage is that if we get EN 8176 early enough, then BS 9991 will be able to refer to that for the description of an evacuation lift, and that's very appealing. So just touching quickly on 2 of those 3 possible evacuation operations foreseen in EN 8176, or we hope will be in EN 8176. I'll move fairly quickly over the driver-assisted operation because I think it's something that we recognise already through BS 9999. The idea is you have an evacuation lift switch at the exit floor, and if someone uses that evacuation lift switch, it recalls the evacuation lift, and then they can take control of the lift using the car controls. And landing calls will be disabled, so that the lift would be under the sole control of the person in the car. There's advantages and disadvantages with that model. The great advantage is if you've got a driver or you've got an assistant in the lift car who's driving it, they can respond to the situation as they see it on each floor. The big disadvantage, and now coming back to the scope of BS 991 or 991 is that if you've got an unmanaged residential building with a driver assisted operation, the lift is not available until someone comes on site who can take control of it. And there's also an issue about availability and training of drivers. Getting on to the automatic operation and having another look at that, I think that's really quite interesting, and it's the new thing which EN 8176 will bring and be of great value potentially to unmanaged residential situations. So as I mentioned earlier, the lift will recall to the exit floor initially when the evacuation starts. Now the lift is in terms of how it behaves, is a relatively unintelligent thing. It needs to be told what to do. So the lift will need an external signal to tell it it's not in normal operation anymore, and it has to now behave under evacuation control. Thereafter, the lift will serve landing calls, as I mentioned earlier, but in a kind of special way. And EN 8176 will foresee two ways that the lift might prioritize calls. The first one, if the systems in the building, like the fire detection and alarm system, have an intelligent enough interface with the lift, it might be possible to tell the lift where the alarm floor is, the fire floor, and then the lift would prioritize calls from that floor or up to 2 floors either side of that. And if it doesn't have calls from that zone, it might then accept calls from the rest of the building. So that's one approach. In simple buildings, it might be that there's not a sophisticated enough fire detection alarm system to do that, and you can see this in maybe a 2 or 3 or 4 floor building. Then it might be better simply for the lift to respond to calls from any floor and just handle those on a time-based approach. So there is a great advantage with that that's recognised. The lift could be used immediately, so systems in the building could switch. After a fire alarm, could switch it into evacuation operation very quickly. It would not have to wait for a driver to mobilise. I'm conscious I'm probably running out of time. Key things that EN 8176 will do is it will describe the lift and the lift operation. It won't say very much about anything beyond the lift. It will be for standards such as BS 991 and 9999 in the future to say something more about what the building, protection for the lift and other related issues look like. I just want to touch on a few watch points for the application of this, which I guess we might pick up in future presentations. I've already alluded to the importance of the external system, external to the lift, the building system, to tell the lift what to do. That's a significant area of work. Capacity assessment is, I've not included a slide on that. Rachel included a fantastic slide earlier in her presentation showing how the numbers of people who might well demand an evacuation lift will increase with floor height. And I think that's intuitively clear. I think no matter how fit we are, and what our physical condition, if you put us in a tall enough building, in the end, I think most of us will head for a lift. So there's an idea that as floor height increases, so does the proportion of the floor population that you might choose to evacuate by lift. And that will be really important to take into capacity assessment. The other thing which will be important to consider, of course, is is the required time for the evacuation. Although the lift standard will be completely silent on that, that's something outside the lift. I won't speak about secondary supplies very much. Martin touched on that earlier and mentioned BS 8519. All I would say is Annex G in BS 9999 has this idea of, for an evacuation lift, of either using a secondary power supply, but it does also point to the possibility of using a second supply route, but where that's done, have some sort of risk assessment done, if you like, and the potential of using something called automatic rescue operation for the lift. That's quite interesting, because it really says is, well, if you lose the power supply, the lift should at least be able to recover to a floor and release any trapped passengers. And then there's the idea that, you know, if the lift spaces are compromised in some way, then lift service should be suspended. And water ingress needs to be looked at, and I would guess much as BS 9999 does with, I think, Annex N. So those are all building related interface issues that we would need to return to and consider in more detail. I've got a last slide. I'm going to move on over it very quickly because I've essentially run out of time. If we do all that work that we just mentioned, we're getting an 8176 out supporting guidance, we will have completed the benchmarks for the new lift situation. But I think there's a recognition that the wider demands of improving building safety cannot be met simply by improving our new benchmarks. And I mentioned BS 8899 earlier, and I said to be revised ? I would say it's close to a certainty that will need to be revised, and that will be one part of the work going towards looking at how evacuation provision in existing buildings could be improved. Right, I've overrun, for which I apologise. I guess I'm pick up Q&A later. I believe I'm passing over to Brett. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll pick up questions later.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nick, for that informative presentation. Welcome, everybody. My name is Brett Egan-Briers. I'm a retired fire officer. My current role is as the National PPE Technical Advisor for the National Fire Chiefs Council, which is the professional voice of the UK Fire and Rescue Services. I'm Vice Chair of the NFCC PPE and Clothing Committee, and I chair BSI Committee PH14 for Firefighters PPE, and represent NFCC on a whole host of other mirror committees within BSI related to SEN for footwear, clothing, gloves, and firefighters' helmets. I suppose I'm here to discuss the last line of defence for firefighters. Their firefighting PPE and is used when things go wrong. We've spoken about many aspects of fire safety today, which is looking to prevent those types of occurrences or assist in operations. But ultimately, we have to commit people into scenarios to save life and or property. And firefighting PPE is being faced by a whole host of challenges. Some of them are new, and some of them relate to new research, which is having an impact. And we're trying to address those through standards, which my colleague David, I'm sure, will come on to later. So back in 1986, when I joined Kent Fire and Rescue Service, this is the personal protective clothing that we used at this time: heavy woolen tunics, rubber Wellington boots, cork helmets, and PVC plastic leggings or wet legs. In 1987, the King's Cross fire happened, and we lost firefighters and members of the public. And it was at that stage that the Home Office introduced some form of standards for firefighters' PPE, and work began on the first EN standard, EN 469, for firefighters' clothing, and that was eventually published in 1995. So from then, we've moved on quite a way in terms of the technicality of firefighters' PPE. It's now classed as Class 3 PPE, as highly technical within the regulations. And the current standard EN 469 has 2 levels of protection. And in the UK, we demand the highest level of protection within the standard, which is the minimum level of performance. But we also add our own enhanced specification to that. And currently EN 469 is a restricted standard, a designated standard with restrictions, just because we believe that it can be improved, and the firefighters in the UK want that additional protection. And its purpose is for fighting fires and rescues within structures. So what does that actually look like? Well, fires account for about 27% of our call activity. They can be split into various types and categories of fire. But if we delve into that and relate that back to the fact that EN 469 firefighter clothing protection is for fires in structures, that actually only equates to about 7% of our activity. Sorry, I've got dogs barking. I do apologise if you can hear that. So that actually equates to 7% of our activity, and that means that we're using that structural firefighting clothing for about 93% of our other activity, and clearly that has a reality where we are using structural firefighting kit in situations and operational environments which are clearly not what it's designed for. So as you can see, for wildland firefighting or for technical rescues, road traffic accidents, road traffic collisions, etc. Now, we already have specific PPE for operating in specific environments, and for technical rescue there's both EN standards and ISO standards, and within the wildfire arena, again, there are ISO standards and EN standards. The fact is that having multiple sets of kit not only takes up space, but is very difficult to predict which type of clothing you should operate in at any one given moment in time. Furthermore, and most recently, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified firefighting as a carcinogenic occupation in its highest category, Group 1. And that's mainly related to the toxic effects from fire effluent, and most particularly to the per or polyfluorinated alkyl substances, the PFASs, which are associated with that fire effluent. So what does that actually mean for us? It means that our clothing is contaminated, that the firefighters are contaminated with this fire effluent, and that can lead to ongoing issues in the future. But PFAS also exists within our PPE, as it does in many commonly occurring items that we come across in our daily lives, in furnishing, in carpets, in our cookware example, and in waterproof outdoor clothing. So we have it as a moisture barrier within our firefighting PPE, and it's also used as a coating to the outer fabric for the chemical repellency. And we've actually got a working group within NFCC working on this contamination issue right at this moment in time. But it also then comes on to cleaning of the kit and the appropriate cleaning methodology, and assessing how clean is clean and which processes are the best to clean the garments once they've been used and contaminated. We're also hit by the environmental factors and the changing climate. I'm sure we're all aware of the IPCC assessment, the Environment Programme from the UN, all predicting that our climate is getting warmer, our own experiences of the summer of 22, and as I said, we've got firefighters using structural firefighting kit externally in the environment where it's not really suited for. Other big topic items within the fire industry which require addressing through our standards is the equality, diversity and inclusion. Obviously a representative employer, and therefore we need to ensure that the fit of our garments is appropriate. It's personal protective equipment, that we have to take account of the gender and any religious requirements within the sector and for those individuals who require protection. And also it gives us the opportunity to develop a brand for the fire service to ensure that the public are aware of who we are and that they can trust us to do a professional job. So what is it that we're actually looking for in terms of firefighters' PPE? Well, clearly there's the heat and flame resistance elements to the garments. There's also the mechanical properties to ensure that it's robust for the operating environments. And then most importantly, the comfort for the wearer to ensure that they can undertake the tasks within the jobs that they have to encounter. So the thermal intensity faced by firefighters obviously ranges depending on where they are, and we categorize them into these three categories: the routine operations for external attack, more hazardous situations for internal attack, and then when things completely go wrong and we end up in a flashover situation. You can see the temperature ranges there and the heat flux, and the operating time ranges from the routine where we're comfortable for 10 to 20 minutes close to the source of the fire, but in a flashover situation we're talking about protection of less than 1 minute. I think we have to be extremely careful of what we ask for in terms of the performance of our firefighting PPE. There are so many challenges that it needs to protect against and perform against, and of course we know that this has to be a balance. And when we're talking about firefighters PPE internally, we always describe the old graphic equalizer, where there are so many different elements of performance, but actually they all need to be in balance with each other to provide a good garment. And we have to be aware of the thermal burden to the individual, the physiological impact of wearing the PPE, and ensure that there's good thermoregulation to ensure that they remain comfortable, that their body core temperatures don't increase dramatically to a point where they start to make poor decisions. So there are a number of new threats that we're also dealing with, very topical. Lithium-ion battery fires from scooters or cars, the ferocity of those types of fires, and the elements that and hazardous substances which are expelled as a result, one of which is molten metals. So we're ensuring that there's some molten metal protection to the fabrics, and also attacks on firefighters, which does include the terrorist threat. But most recently in the news over the weekend, you may have caught that there's been a very dramatic increase on attacks on firefighters, fireworks being pointed at them, bricks being thrown at them, and quite a sad indictment on our society at the moment. But again, these are additional threats which we have to protect our firefighters from. So a couple of other challenges, our changing role, the fire service is evolving. It's not just about fighting fires now. Obviously, we deal with wildland firefighting, water rescue, rescue from heights, assisting the ambulance service, search and rescue operations. And so we need equipment and personal protective equipment that's suitable for that new range of activities. The contaminants we've already covered in terms of the fire effluent and how appropriately the garments are cleaned, whether that's using new technology such as liquid CO2 cleaning methodologies. We want to strive for inter and intraoperability with our PPE. The end user feedback is that the garments tend to be too hot, too cumbersome to undertake the activities, so there's room for improvement there. And then, of course, sustainability and circularity of the core elements of the equipment to ensure that it can be from sustainable sources, it can be reused, repurposed, or recycled at the end of its life. And of course, collaboration and economies of scale where we can drive that to ensure that we get a good value for money from the public purse. So all in all of these new challenges that are faced by our firefighters and the impact that that has on its PPE means that our standards need to keep pace with these changing issues and challenges. And both in ISO and CEN, work is being undertaken within the committees at BSI to ensure that the UK input is put into the standards so that they can be improved. And I'm sure that, as I said at the beginning, my colleague Dave Matthews will cover that in the next presentation. So I think that's me. Hopefully I may have even caught up some time, and I'd now like to hand you over to my colleague Dave Matthews, who I'm sure will introduce himself. Thank you all.
David, I think you're just on mute. Well, David, if you just go into the audio drop down and then just where the mic is, you might just need to select the correct mic there. Sorry, that's still not picking it up there, David. You just try popping your headset in and out.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, David.
Sorry about that. As introduced, I run Fire and Industrial PPE Limited, but I go back a little further than the last speaker, Brett. I was a fire officer, and if I could use language that is not appropriate now, but it was when men were men and firemen were firemen, and I was getting blown up, thrown out of buildings, ending up in hospital on emergency oxygen, and thinking, I really don't understand this. So just a comment on this morning, and Brett's touched on it. We had the Grenfell incident, and a lot of the new fire safety issues that are being dealt with by BSI, CEN and ISO affect the emergency services and firefighters, like PPE, RPD, travel distances, etc. And one of the issues this morning showed all the major stakeholders. And of course, the TUC and the Fire Brigade Union were not on there, which is a disappointment. So next slide, please. the hierarchy of standards globally is accepted that ISO is the dominant standards body, and then you have CEN and regional standards bodies like ASTM, NFPA, BSI, etc. And that is accepted. I guess it might not be so in America, who can be a bit inward looking, although we're beginning to work hard on that. But there is an issue around this problem of ISO when we're working on Vienna agreements. Many of you will be aware of that, where we're developing a CEN and an ISO together in harmony. But we have the difficulty where in Europe we have HAS consultants who have to assess the standard, whereas in ISO they don't have that. And that can be a huge roadblock in time, and the ISO delegates getting pretty annoyed that this individual has the powers to in fact veto a standard because she or he doesn't like it. So next standard, please. Next slide, please. The big issue for us at the moment, and this is across all standards and all industries globally, and it's this PFAS. And we know that the European Commission are consulting on PFAS, and they're out, I think they're closed in September, and they're probably now adjudicating on all the comments that were submitted. We know that the UK government, because we're not members of the EU, although we're full members of CEN, the UK government is consulting on PFAS, and we know the American government and regions are also looking at PFAS. The problem around that, of course, for every industry is that we are going to have at least 3 major regulations on PFAS. That's the EU, the UK, and the USA. And it will require every organization and business to, in fact, conduct a PFAS assessment of themselves and all of their suppliers down the line as to whether they advertently or inadvertently add PFAS to their product. And it's quite alarming to see some industries and on some of the BSI committees who are saying, why are we discussing this? It doesn't affect my product. And then when the chair or a member of it or seals in BA says, well, of course it does. So it really is a big issue. And for us standardizers, I'll come further on to that. Next slide, please. So that's where it is. Brett touched briefly on that. It's in everything, from water supplies to food supplies to your furniture to your electronics. And so what needs to be done is it needs to be dealt with and addressed in a responsible manner, and not some will ban this, because if you do that, it can introduce other hazards. And I'll come on to that on the firefighters' clothing. But you can see from that that in fact everything, and therefore the Commission, the UK government, the USA, and other countries are going to have to get their head around how we address that issue. Next slide, please. Presently, we're told there are over 10,000 of these PFASs that have been identified. And as you harmful, so harmful. And we as standardizers are not experts on that, and we're not getting any lead from the Commission or the UK government. We do get a little bit from the USA from Homeland Securities about which of those are hazardous. I've mentioned those different sets of regulations, and in fact, a couple of weeks ago, there's the latest class action in the USA with 8,000 plaintiffs suing the 4 who manufacture PPE in America. And we are informed that a venture capitalist from America has now provided $500 million US into the EU and UK to support actions taken against corporations. And wouldn't that be lovely if we had that to determine what the risks were and how to deal with it. Next slide, please. So ISO SC14 is the Firefighters PPE Committee. BSI have always supported this since its inception in 2000, and in fact do publicize most of the ISOs as BSISO documents. And we've heard from Brett about the World Health Organization designating firefighting as an at-risk occupation last year, which led to the chair of ISO TC94, the overall global PPE committee, instructing SC14 to address this matter immediately. The chair of SC14 picked that up, and in fact I chair Working Group 1 General Requirements, and he directed myself to in fact begin addressing that. So around July this year, I formed a project group on contaminants, and so delegates from the SC14 Working Group 1 who wanted to sit on that project group. We were fortunate that very quickly we achieved a balance between end users and manufacturers, and Brett is on there as one of the end users, and I closed that call early. Since then, that project group, who's led by an officer in Australia who's a cancer survivor, but he's also a union lead over there, is the most eminent person who could lead that. We're meeting at least monthly, and we intend to have a draft report which will publish to when SC14 Working Group 1, 2 and 3 meet at BSI on February the 7th. But the workload of SC14 is immense, because unlike any standards in Europe, and this will most of the standards are ensemble standards. So they go through from part 1 to 10. Structural gear.
David, sorry to
10.
interrupt it. I think there might be an issue with the cable in your headset. When you move it, there's a crackling noise that comes up. I think still.
Is that all right?
I can hear you now. Yeah, it just seems to crackle when you lean back or move slightly.
Okay, I'll try and keep still. So the ensemble standards, parts 1 to 10, whether that's structural, wildland, rescue, and those sort of standards can't be handled in Europe because that would cut across 5 or 6 different TCs. So next slide, please. The good news is that following earlier failed attempts some years ago, pre-COVID, there was a discussion about introducing a new SEN horizontal PPE committee, which could in fact handle such, not only those, but many others, like diversity, like ergonomics, like compatibility, like cancer of firefighters. So SEN BT held the ballot earlier this year. BSI had worked through a business plan and fortunately agreed that BSI would act as secretariat if approached. And that was agreed with Sarah Gibbs from BSI, and that new horizontal TC is now being named JTC 23, and Sarah's doing the legwork on preparing for the first meeting and what business will be on that first meeting, because it's intended that we'll probably form a number of working groups under that JTC, gender diversity, complex ensembles, but I have asked for things like cancer of firefighters to be put on there, etc. And just in the lunchtime, as Red Hot News as it were, I note that BSI now have formed a horizontal committee to mirror this new JTC 23. Next slide, please. So touched on the cleaning, maintenance and repair of firefighters PPE. In Europe, we've been looking at cancer of firefighters for over a decade. and that's a standard item on the agenda for the CEN TC162 Working Group 2 Heat and Flame Committee. But twice I tried to get a standard within there similar to the American standard, but it was blocked by some industry. And therefore PH14, BSI PH14, which I chaired at the time, which Brett Egan now chairs, Brett led that project group, and we published 8617 2019, which deals with the PAHs on the outer shell, again coming from the combustions of smoke, and there's 2,000 byproducts. Many of those are carcinogenic. And in ISO, a more complex document, ISO 23616, has been published that we've put into immediate revision, and things like the LCO2, liquid CO2 decontamination procedures are likely to be looked at. And certainly in America, where all of the class actions on PPE and PFAS, they're revising NFPA 1851, which will become 1850, and they will undoubtedly deal with some of the PFAS issues. So we're dealing with the cleaning and maintenance, we're dealing with station clean, cab clean, etc. So I mentioned earlier the sensibility and acting with reasonable assumptions on how we deal with those PFAS issues. Next slide, please. Many of us work in BSI, we work in CEN, and we work in ISO. And it's sometimes difficult to comprehend why we can't have a global standard. And this can be a business generated issue. And when you wonder about that, it's because they can charge more in one part of the globe than another part of the globe. And yet we see the same firefighters generally doing the same sort of task globally. And we have these varying standards across the world. So there's many of us are striving to have this global standard. And as I sit on BSI, CEN, ISO, and the American committees, we're having some level of success on that. Next slide, please. Yeah, I must mention, of course, the EU, BSI and the UK are still full members of CEN-CENELEC, and we congratulate BSI and the government for allowing that to continue. We're not in the EU, but we're still in CEN-CENELEC. We're in the yellow designated membership zone. I think we're the only country down there, which only comes into play if there's any close votes. But of course, when we did leave the EU and it led to the UKCA, we have to say that that cost millions to industry. And it led to a number of notified bodies in the UK opening facilities in the EU in order that they could continue certifying in Europe, and also some other countries introducing UKCA certification regimes into the UK. When the government kicked that into the long grass recently, whilst it was welcome, I can tell you the industry is certainly not amused at the amount of funds they've had to spend on certifying to EN and then to UKCA for what is virtually the same product. There is this OPSS designation with restrictions, and it's been mentioned previously by Brett, but industry needs to understand what they're doing with that, because on certain BSI committees I sit on, when I point out that a manufacturer of for instance, a CAPA set, if they don't like the standard and we put a national forward in, and there's a designation in the UK, that set in Europe will not be allowed to be sold into the UK. And that's an education that needs to be put across to business. So careful consideration needs to be done when a BSI committee wants a national forward. Next slide, please. So that's the run round of the standards. It's intense. I would again like to say that all of the delegates, like Brett, like myself and others, there is no funding from CEN or ISO for conveners or attendance at committees, and it is getting more and more difficult to get delegates to attend, particularly when they're outside of Europe. We might be in Brazil or Japan or America for a week at a time. So we welcome all new standards. We're looking at the diversity issues, and just recently I'm working with BSI managers about the PPE that we have to provide or should be providing for children, and designating what the child means. We're uncertain of that. So thanks a lot, Chair, and obviously we'll be open to questions on the panel.
Thank you, David. And thank you also to Nick and Brett, and perhaps you could rejoin us now. Great, welcome back. We've actually had a couple of questions come in, which I think is a tribute to how comprehensive and clear your presentations have been. The first one is for Nick. BS 9991 is currently working through the responses to comments and changing text as it goes. How can it then register BSEN 81 Part 76 if there are no comments already received drawing reference to changes introduced by 8176? Will BS 9991 have to be revised immediately when it's published?
That's a good question. The draft BS 9991 that came out for public consultation actually had some detailed content in Annex G, and the proposal is essentially to use the relevant equivalent parts of EN 8176 in place of Annex G. So there already was some detailed comment on the content of Annex G, and obviously as part of the comment resolution on BS 9991, those comments need to be looked at and resolved.
Thank you, Nick. And then one for Brett, although David might have some thoughts on it as well, I suspect, but perhaps Brett, if you could have a go at answering first. What is the level of concern for firefighters from the levels and types of toxic gases produced in modern building fire situations?
I think this really relates to the issue around the heightened occurrences of cancers within firefighters globally, related to the fire effluent. It's certainly been borne out by the World Health Organization categorization that firefighting is a carcinogenic occupation. Obviously, we've been aware of the risk from asbestos for many years within the industry, but now there are certainly evidence that the toxic substances given off by the fire are causing issues to the health of those responding to those incidents. And I think that is the greatest concern amongst the end users at this moment in time. And as I alluded to, those commonly occurring products, the PFASs, are actually an inherent part of our firefighting PPE as well, as they are with many other commonly found items, and hence why they're found in fire effluent when fires occur. So that's the biggest ticket item at the moment.
Thank you. David, do you have any thoughts to add on that question?
I mean, just a couple. Brett's touched on most of it, but historically, ignorantly, when we only had single pane glazing, often that glazing had gone before the fireys got there. So it vented. And of course, now we have double and triple glazing. So the fire bottles up. And so the firefighters now and the officers are experienced in how to handle that. But just touching on that PFAS, the C8, C6 chemical train that we've had to address, I'm trying to educate those who want to fly lawsuits against everybody that we can take these out overnight of firefighters' garments. The minute you do that, you will then allow chemicals, petrol, and oil to enter in through the garment, and the firefighter actually becomes flammable. So this is a balance that we're taking. And, you know, we haven't had firefighters injured generally in Europe with it, you know, with any pointer at the PPE. So these are things. But the final point I would like to make is that Brett and I sit on all these committees, and we get no scientific input either from the Commission or from the UK government about what we should be doing on that. And it's left to the NFCC through Brett and others. I mean, big corporations will spend hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds to, you know, present their argument about where their product's good. So, yeah, it's a challenge, but we're up to it, I think, and we're facing it.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are the questions that we've had on this section of the conference. So thank you to Nick, to Brett, and to David. And I think that means we've come to the end of our time today. So I hope you all agree that we've had some really informative presentations today, and that they've given rise to some interesting discussions in the Q&A sessions. We've had updates on the work going on to revise BS 9991 and BSEN 81 Part 76. We've heard about the development of the new BS 9792 and the proposal to update BS 8644 Part 1. And we've learned more about the building safety regime, the competence of professionals in the fire sector, firefighters' PPE, and how SEN and ISO are approaching PPE standards. Thank you very much to all of our speakers today for their participation. We really appreciate them taking the time to share their expertise, and I hope you found it useful as well. We have some more upcoming events lined up for you. In particular, next month we have our Global Built Environment Summit on the 6th and 7th of December. Across those 2 days, there are 4 sessions on sustainable construction, AI and small businesses, quality facilities management and construction products, and health, safety and well-being. And then in January, we have one of our regular webinars on the built environment, and that will be a review of 2023 and looking forward to what's going to be happening in 2024. So that's all from BSI Fire Conference for 2023. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you again at a future event. Goodbye.